Three elderly sisters went to their weekly bingo game, a routine they'd kept for decades. But 20 years later, their car was found submerged in a lake, and what investigators discovered inside changes everything about their disappearance. In Lakeside, Ohio, a small town on the shores of Lake Erie, the Whitman sisters were beloved fixtures in the community. Margaret, 86, Eleanor, 83, and Beatrice, 89, three widows sharing a Victorian house on Maple Street, represented the heart of the town. Always dressed in impeccably pressed floral blouses, the sisters were constant presences at local events, distributing their famous cinnamon cookies at summer festivals, craft fairs, and church fundraisers. Eleanor had sung in the Methodist church choir for nearly 50 years. Her soft voice, though weakened by age, still moved the faithful during Sunday hymns. Beatrice, widowed from the respected Dr. Thomas Whitman since 1988, tirelessly coordinated fundraising campaigns for the local hospital. Margaret, the most reserved of the three, was known for her unfailing sense of humor and for maintaining the award-winning garden that was a mandatory stop on Lakeside's annual garden tour. The sisters' routine was as reliable as the church bell. Every Wednesday at precisely 6:30 in the evening, the 1983 red Pontiac would exit the garage with Margaret at the wheel, driving carefully down County Road 17 to the parish hall, where the three participated in bingo night, a ritual they had maintained for more than 3 decades. On the evening of October 12, 2001, a month after the terrorist attacks that had left the entire country on edge, Martha Collins, the sisters' neighbor of 20 years, waved from her porch while watering her begonias. She watched as the red Pontiac pulled out at 6:45, 15 minutes later than usual. Martha noticed what appeared to be a small argument inside the car, with Eleanor gesturing uncharacteristically. An autumn storm was beginning to form over the lake, with dark clouds advancing rapidly. "Drive carefully, girls," Martha called out, receiving only a brief wave from Margaret in return. It was the last time anyone in Lakeside saw the Whitman sisters. The following morning, Michael Whitman, their 47-year-old nephew and only close relative, arrived for the Saturday breakfast they shared weekly. He found the house empty, the beds untouched, and the newspapers still wrapped on the porch. The Pontiac wasn't in the garage. On the kitchen counter, 3 half-empty teacups suggested a hasty departure. "Aunt Bee? Aunt Ellie? Aunt Maggie?" Michael called, walking through the silent rooms. The absence of his aunts was so unusual that, as he dialed the police number, his knees gave way, and he collapsed into an armchair in the living room, surrounded by black and white photographs documenting decades of Whitman family history in Lakeside. Sheriff Dave Patterson, who had grown up eating the Whitman sisters' cookies at school events, arrived personally at the residence in less than 10 minutes. "They've never missed an appointment in their lives," Michael explained, his voice trembling. "And they would never, ever sleep away from home without telling someone." Patterson immediately initiated a search. Officers covered the entire route between the sisters' house and the church, where the pastor confirmed they had never arrived for bingo. The previous night's storm had been particularly strong, with winds up to 45 miles per hour sweeping the lakeshore and causing power outages in several areas. "Maybe they got lost in the storm and sought shelter somewhere," suggested the sheriff, though his expression betrayed genuine concern. "We'll check hospitals and gas stations within a 30-mile radius." On the third day of searching, with volunteer teams combing the lake shores and helicopters flying over the region, the Lakeside Police Department received 2 contradictory pieces of information. A gas station attendant in Sandusky, 30 miles away, claimed to have seen 3 elderly ladies in a red Pontiac refueling at 9 in the evening that night, while a fisherman reported hearing an impact sound and seeing headlights plunging into the lake waters near an area known as Calderwood Cove during the height of the storm. "It doesn't make sense," Michael muttered, examining his aunt's bank statements that the police had requested. "They didn't withdraw money, didn't use cards, didn't take extra clothes. They just vanished." While diving teams began to probe the turbulent waters of Calderwood Cove, the Lakeside community gathered for a vigil at the church. Pastor Roger Williams led prayers for the dear Bingo sisters, as he affectionately referred to them, while silent tears rolled down the faces of those present. A week after the disappearance, with water searches hampered by weather conditions and no new concrete leads, Michael observed an old photograph of his aunts on the living room wall. In it, the three smiled in front of the Pontiac when it was new, almost 20 years earlier. Something in their gaze, a gleam of determination he had never noticed before, made a disturbing thought cross his mind for the first time. What if they had chosen to disappear? Dawn broke over Calderwood Cove as boats from the search and rescue team formed a perimeter on the water. Divers checked their equipment while Michael observed from the shore, the crumpled note about Charles folded in his pocket. The enigmatic message haunted him: time to do what Charles should have done. What had his uncle been involved in that could possibly be connected to his aunt's disappearance? The divers' faces were tense as they communicated through underwater signals, visibility hampered by the recent storm. Beams of light cut through the murky darkness below as they methodically searched the area where Tom Jenkins had reported seeing headlights plunging into the water. While the search continued, Michael drove back to his aunt's Victorian home and headed straight for Charles's old office. He meticulously rummaged through drawers and files, finding folders labeled Municipal Fund, with cryptic notations in the margins, numbers and initials that made little sense to him, but suggested something more complex than simple accounting. That evening, the Methodist Church in Lakeside was packed for a vigil, candles glowing in the hands of attendees as Pastor Roger Williams led prayers. "Our dear Bingo sisters," he said, his voice breaking slightly as he looked at the three photographs adorning the altar. "May the Lord guide them safely back to us." Martha Collins organized search parties the next morning, spreading maps across her kitchen table as neighbors gathered to divide the town and surrounding areas into sectors for a systematic search. "We'll cover every inch," she promised Michael, squeezing his hand. On the fourth day of the search, the radio on the main rescue boat crackled with the excited voice of a diver. "We've got something!" Metal reflecting at approximately 55 feet appears to be a vehicle. A specialized rescue team arrived from Cleveland with more advanced water salvage equipment. Sheriff Patterson updated them on the situation while local media began to gather at the shoreline, cameras trained on the water's surface. The tension was palpable during the vehicle recovery operation. Cables were secured by divers, while cranes on the shore slowly brought the red Pontiac to the surface, water streaming from its closed windows. A crowd had formed, and absolute silence fell as the car fully emerged, revealing itself to be empty. No bodies, no personal belongings, nothing to indicate what had happened to the Whitman sisters. Michael's expression was devastated as he stood staring at the dripping vehicle that had carried his aunts for decades. The absence of bodies offered a glimmer of hope, but also deepened the mystery considerably. At the police station, Patterson had a map of the region on the wall with search area markings. He spoke on the phone with authorities from neighboring towns, while his secretary handled constant calls from the press. The case was beginning to attract wider attention. Michael set up in a makeshift hotel room, spreading his Uncle Charles's documents across the bed, connecting them with newspaper clippings about Lakeside's municipal administration. Something didn't add up, but he couldn't yet see the full picture. The following day, Patterson and Michael interviewed Stan Kowalski, a 59-year-old bus driver, at the Cleveland bus station. "Yes, I remember them clearly," Stan confirmed. Three well-dressed elderly ladies, one wearing a shiny bird brooch. They boarded the northbound Michigan bus on the morning of October 13th. This revelation shifted the investigation dramatically. Michael returned to searching through his uncle's belongings and discovered a hidden folder at the bottom of a box, containing bank statements from an unknown account in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The statements showed regular deposits coinciding with dates of town council meetings. That night, Michael returned to the sisters' Victorian house, illuminated only by his flashlight as he examined the floor in Margaret's bedroom. Finding loose boards under the carpet, he pried them up to reveal a hiding place. What he found left him speechless: 3 recently issued passports with different names but photos of his aunts, alongside a map of Canada with the city of Thunder Bay circled in red. As Michael sat staring at the passports in disbelief, his cell phone rang. It was Patterson calling urgently to inform him that a preliminary audit of Charles Whitman's financial records had revealed a misappropriation of nearly $3 million from the municipal pension fund, and FBI agents would be in Lakeside by morning to take over the case. The temporary FBI headquarters in the town hall meeting room buzzed with activity as Special Agent Diana Chen methodically pinned photos and documents to a timeline board. At 42, Chen had built her career on attention to detail, and this case, with its missing elderly sisters and financial impropriety, demanded nothing less. Michael entered hesitantly, the passports hidden in his inside jacket pocket. He watched the federal agents reviewing his uncle's financial documents, their expressions grave as they uncovered more evidence of the massive fraud. On the wall, old photographs of Charles Whitman receiving civic awards now hung next to highlighted bank statements showing suspicious transfers. The contrast between the public figure and the apparent criminal was jarring. "When was the last time your aunts mentioned concerns about your uncle's finances?" Agent Chen asked, her notepad already filled with meticulous notes. Her direct approach was refreshing after days of uncertainty. Michael closed his eyes, remembering a moment from 20 years earlier. At Charles's funeral in 1999, he had noticed his aunts huddled in a corner of the church, Beatrice gesturing emphatically, while Eleanor and Margaret listened with concerned expressions. He had thought nothing of it then, just grief manifesting differently among siblings. "I don't think they ever directly mentioned concerns," Michael admitted, "but there might have been signs I missed." Across town at the municipal library, Lakeside's gardening club had gathered, elderly ladies exclaiming in shock as they discussed the news about Charles Whitman. Martha Collins was particularly vocal, defending the sisters fiercely. "They couldn't have known," she insisted, her hands trembling around her teacup. "Beatrice would have done something if she'd known." That evening, in his Cleveland apartment, Michael emptied a box of family mementos onto his bed. Among the birthday cards and Christmas photos, he found a photograph he'd never paid much attention to before. Charles with his sisters in Thunder Bay, Canada, from 1975. On the back, in Margaret's neat handwriting, "Our Refuge." The coincidence with the circled location on the map was impossible to ignore. The next morning, Michael and Agent Chen stood in the Canadian border crossing at International Falls, Minnesota, reviewing security footage from October 2001. After hours of searching, they spotted 3 elderly women crossing the border on a tour bus, Eleanor's distinctive bird brooch visible even on the grainy footage. In a Thunder Bay hotel room later that day, Chen and Michael interviewed the owner of a small bed and breakfast. They stayed just one night, the woman confirmed, studying the photos. Paid cash. Very polite ladies. Said they were visiting old friends. The story was gaining traction back in Lakeside. At the Chronicle offices, veteran journalist Susan Reynolds typed furiously, crafting an article titled, "The Missing Sisters, Fugitives or Victims?" On her screen, photos of the Whitman sisters and Charles sat side by side, their family resemblance pronounced. A tense town meeting followed, with Mayor Warren Mitchell looking visibly nervous as he addressed concerned citizens. A federal audit was scheduled, he admitted reluctantly. There was no reason to alarm the town before we had certainty about any financial irregularities. Later that afternoon, Michael examined the sisters' phone records, discovering several calls to Arnold Levinson, a financial fraud attorney in Cleveland, in the week before their disappearance. This new lead took him to Levinson's imposing downtown office building the following morning. They wanted to know their options if they discovered a family member involved in questionable financial activities, Levinson explained carefully. It was presented as a hypothetical consultation, or so it seemed at the time. That evening, Chen and Michael examined maps of northern Canada spread across a table at the Lakeside Police Station, tracing possible routes from Thunder Bay and highlighting remote areas with minimal oversight. As dusk fell, Michael sat alone in Eleanor's favorite rocking chair on the front porch of the empty Victorian house, holding the enigmatic note about Charles when his cell phone rang. An unknown number appeared on the screen, but when he answered, the caller immediately hung up. When they traced the mysterious call's origin, Michael and Agent Chen discovered it came from a payphone in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And when they accessed security camera footage from the store where the phone was located, they unmistakably recognized Beatrice Whitman's stooped silhouette, nervously glancing over her shoulder as she dialed. The security footage was grainy, but unmistakable. Beatrice Whitman, now a fugitive at 95 years old, had tried to call Michael from a payphone in Winnipeg. This concrete lead sent the investigation speeding northward across the Canadian border. Winnipeg International Airport bustled with activity as Michael and Agent Chen were greeted by Sergeant Robert Fraser of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. At 49, Fraser's weathered face spoke of decades spent policing the vast Canadian wilderness. "We've secured the footage and cordoned off the area," Fraser explained as they walked briskly through the terminal. "Though it's been 24 hours since the call, we might still find something useful." The trio drove directly to the convenience store where the payphone was located. Its owner, a middle-aged Vietnamese immigrant named Tran, greeted them with cautious politeness. "3 American grandmothers, yes," he confirmed after studying the photographs. "The oldest one used the phone. They seemed lost, asked for directions to the bus station. I thought nothing of it." Following this lead, they visited a small boarding house on the outskirts of Winnipeg. The elderly proprietor, Mrs. Patel, retrieved her handwritten guest register with arthritis-slowed movements. "The Miller sisters stayed for 12 days, she said, pointing to the entry. "Very polite ladies. Said they were visiting Canada for the first time since their husbands passed, kept to themselves mostly." The small room the sisters had shared revealed little: 3 meticulously made single beds and a tourist guide to northern Canada on the nightstand, with several pages marked. Michael picked up the guide, noticing Thunder Bay, Winnipeg, and several smaller towns circled in Margaret's distinctive handwriting. Meanwhile, in Lakeside, tensions were rising. At an emergency community meeting in the Methodist Church, Pastor Williams struggled to maintain order as townspeople argued over the sisters' actions. "They're victims in all this," Martha Collins shouted above the din. "They must have been frightened for their lives." "They abandoned us without a word," countered Frank Miller, whose father's pension had been part of the misappropriated funds. "They chose their family name over our livelihoods." The following morning, Susan Reynolds of the Lakeside Chronicle interviewed former colleagues of Charles Whitman. "He was meticulous, perhaps too meticulous," said Janet Harper, who had worked as his secretary for 15 years. "He never allowed anyone to double-check his spreadsheets. We all just trusted him." In a quiet Winnipeg cafe, Michael pored over Eleanor's diary that he had found hidden in the Victorian house's library. The yellowed pages revealed veiled concerns about Charles's questionable financial associations, dating back to the early 90s. "They suspected something for years," Michael told Chen as she joined him at the table. "But family loyalty kept them silent until after his death." At their temporary investigation headquarters, Agent Chen stood before a whiteboard covered with photos, timelines, and maps. Speaking with her team in Lakeside by phone, she learned that the missing $3 million had been traced through a complex web of offshore accounts, but still hadn't been fully recovered. The investigation team spread out across Winnipeg, showing the sisters' photos to local merchants. A pharmacist on Portage Avenue recognized Beatrice immediately. "She bought blood pressure medication about 2 weeks ago," he confirmed. "Mentioned they were planning to head to more remote areas for some peace and quiet." After countless interviews, they finally located James Wong, a 67-year-old taxi driver who had driven the sisters to the central bus station. "Picked them up on October 28th, he said, showing them his meticulously kept logbook. "Nice ladies, but nervous. The oldest one kept watching out the back window, like she thought someone was following." At the bus station, Security footage revealed the sisters' clever strategy. Each had purchased a ticket at a different counter, heading in 3 completely different directions. Margaret bought a ticket to Edmonton in the west, Eleanor to Regina in the southwest, and Beatrice east to Thunder Bay, effectively creating a confusing trail for anyone attempting to follow them. Alone in his hotel room that night, Michael spread family photos across his bed, trying to understand his aunt's strategy. Looking at the destinations they'd chosen, he suddenly noticed a pattern in the seemingly random cities. The next morning, Michael pinned a map of Canada to the wall of their investigation room, connecting the 3 cities with red string. The lines formed a triangle with a small dot in the center: Moose Lake. While the team prepared to depart for Moose Lake the following morning, Agent Chen received an alarming call from her team in Lakeside. Someone had broken into the Whitman sisters' house overnight, methodically searched every room, and left a single message written in red lipstick on Beatrice's bedroom mirror. You weren't the only ones who knew. The red lipstick message on Beatrice's mirror added a disturbing new dimension to the case. Someone else was involved, someone who knew about Charles's fraud and possibly the sisters' escape plan. The invasion of the Victorian house suggested that what had seemed like a straightforward case of financial impropriety might have far darker implications. The small chartered plane carrying Michael, Chen, and Fraser cut through the crisp northern air the following morning. Below them stretched an endless tapestry of forests and lakes, the wilderness of northern Canada vast and intimidating. Michael pressed his forehead against the cold window, watching his breath fog the glass as he contemplated what might await them in Moose Lake. Population 500, Fraser explained over the engine's drone, mostly locals who've been there for generations, plus a few Americans looking to get away from civilization. Their arrival at Moose Lake's tiny airstrip was met with an icy wind and the suspicious gaze of Jim Mackenzie, the local sheriff. A weathered man of 60 with deep creases around his eyes, Mackenzie made no effort to hide his displeasure at federal agents invading his jurisdiction. Didn't know we were expecting visitors from the government, he remarked dryly, leading them to his mud-splattered truck. Especially American government. The town's single main street revealed a row of wooden establishments: a general store, a diner, a small medical clinic, and the Pine Retreat Lodge where they would be staying. Locals paused their activities to watch the strangers, their expressions guarded and unwelcoming. Inside their rustic room at the lodge, Chen immediately called her team in Lakeside. Her face darkened as she received the update. We've confirmed the fingerprints belong to Gregory Whitman, she told Michael after hanging up. Your cousin was definitely in the house, but he's nowhere to be found now. Michael sank onto the edge of the bed, memories of Gregory flooding back. His 55-year-old cousin had always shown an unusual interest in the Victorian house, frequently commenting on its substantial market value and how 3 elderly women could hardly maintain such a property. His appearance at family gatherings had always been brief, his conversations inevitably steering toward real estate and inheritance. The team split up to canvass the town, each taking a section of Mackenzie's crude hand-drawn map. Michael found himself facing closed expressions and clipped responses as he showed photographs of his aunts to shopkeepers and residents. Folks come here for privacy, one man told him bluntly before walking away. It's the unwritten rule of Moose Lake, mind your own business. At the small sheriff's office that afternoon, Mackenzie spread out detailed topographical maps across his desk. We've got at least 20 isolated properties within a 30-mile radius, he explained, pointing to areas marked with red dots, most only accessible by float plane or rough trails, perfect for people who don't want to be found. During dinner at the town's only restaurant, Michael methodically approached each table, showing the now familiar photographs. When he reached Jenny Thompson, a young waitress of 23, he noticed her eyes widen momentarily before she quickly shook her head and turned away. Meanwhile, Chen and Fraser discovered something significant at the tiny records office. Among the property deeds was a cabin registered to Thomas Whitman, Beatrice's husband, who had died in 1988. After her shift ended, Michael followed Jenny down the darkened street, catching up to her near the general store. "Please," he said gently when she tried to hurry past. "They're my family, if you know anything at all." Jenny's resistance crumbled under his sincere plea. "I also work at Pine Retreat," she admitted in a hushed voice. "They stayed in room 8 last November. A man in a blue Ford pickup came for them the next morning. They asked me not to tell anyone." Back at the records office, the team examined the details of Thomas Whitman's property, an isolated cabin on the shore of a smaller lake, accessible only by a primitive forest road that looked barely maintained on the maps. Sheriff Mackenzie reluctantly began preparing for an expedition. "That area becomes practically unreachable when it snows," he warned, checking the gray sky. "If we're going to check it out, it has to be now before the first snowfall hits." Before leaving the lodge, Michael made a final sweep of room 8 and discovered, tucked under the mattress, a small bird-shaped brooch he immediately recognized as Eleanor's. Clutching this confirmation of his aunt's presence, he joined the others in 2 aging four-wheel-drive vehicles crawling along the deteriorating forest road as the sky darkened with snow clouds. When they finally spotted the wooden cabin by the lake, seemingly abandoned with dark windows, the first snowflake fell, and suddenly, a thin trail of smoke began rising from the chimney, followed by the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked and a trembling but resolute feminine voice ordering from inside the cabin, "Turn around right now, or the next shot won't be a warning." The tension hung in the frozen air as Michael stepped forward alone, hands raised high above his head. His breath formed white clouds that dissipated in the frigid atmosphere. Behind him, Chen, Fraser, and Mackenzie remained frozen by their vehicles, weapons drawn but pointed downward. "Tia B? Tia Eleanor? Tia Margaret? It's me, Michael," he called out, his voice breaking with emotion. The snow was falling more heavily now, dusting his dark hair with white flakes that melted against his scalp. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the cabin door creaked open slowly, revealing Beatrice Whitman, her once auburn hair now completely white, framing a face that had aged significantly in the 6 years since her disappearance. She clutched an old hunting shotgun with surprising steadiness for her 95 years, but when her eyes registered Michael's face, the weapon dipped slightly. "Michael?" she whispered, disbelief and recognition battling across her weathered features. "Oh my God, Michael!" The reunion that followed was a blur of tears and trembling embraces as Michael was ushered inside the modest cabin to find all 3 of his aunts alive. Margaret, now 92, wept openly as she touched his face, while Eleanor, the most frail at 89, could barely rise from her chair by the wood stove. The sisters had aged dramatically, their isolation and the harsh northern climate accelerating time's toll. "We never thought we'd see you again," Margaret murmured, her hands trembling as she prepared tea for everyone in a battered kettle on the wood stove. The moment of reunion was short-lived, however, as Chen and Fraser cautiously entered the cabin, introducing themselves as law enforcement. Beatrice immediately stiffened, positioning herself protectively between her sisters and the officers. "You have no jurisdiction here," she declared firmly. "This is our home now." Eleanor sat quietly in a worn armchair, clutching Michael's hand as though he might disappear. "We found the documents 3 months after Charles's funeral," she explained in a voice barely above a whisper. "Financial records hidden behind a false panel in his desk. Years of theft, Michael. Millions of dollars taken from people's pensions." Beatrice retrieved a weathered folder from a shelf, spreading newspaper clippings and documents across the rough wooden table. "The federal audit was about to begin," she explained, her voice hardening. "Everything would have been exposed. The Whitman name would have been dragged through the mud." Margaret described their elaborate escape plan while serving tea in mismatched cups. After September 11th, everyone was distracted. Security was tightening, but systems weren't connected like they are now. We realized it was our chance to protect what remained of Charles's reputation, and our own. As Chen explained the potential legal ramifications of their situation, Eleanor suddenly paled, her breathing becoming labored. She clutched at her chest, eyes widening in distress. Within seconds, the tension in the room transformed to panic as she slumped forward. "Her medication!" Margaret cried out, pointing to a small wooden box on a shelf. Michael rushed to retrieve it while Fraser, drawing on his emergency medical training, gently lowered Eleanor to the floor. Chen immediately got on her satellite phone, trying to coordinate emergency medical assistance in this remote location while the blizzard intensified outside, making evacuation increasingly unlikely. Michael found Eleanor's pill organizer, meticulously arranged by day and time, evidence of how carefully the sisters had managed their lives, even in hiding. Working together, they managed to stabilize Eleanor, though her condition remained precarious. As night fell, the snowstorm howled around the small cabin, creating a temporary truce as everyone focused on keeping Eleanor comfortable. Michael and Beatrice spoke in hushed tones in the tiny kitchen while the others rested. "We never touched Charles's money, Michael," Beatrice confessed, her weathered hand gripping his arm with surprising strength. "We ran to protect his name, not to benefit from the fraud." When Eleanor finally stabilized and fell asleep, Beatrice led Michael to a small trapdoor hidden beneath a rug in the back bedroom, revealing a built-in safe embedded in the floor. "There's something you need to see. The real reason we had to disappear," she said gravely. And as she opened it, Michael found himself staring at official documents and photographs suggesting that Charles's fraud went far beyond embezzlement, involving powerful figures in Lakeside, including the current mayor Warren Mitchell. Michael stared at the documents spread before him, his mind struggling to process the scope of the conspiracy they revealed. Photographs showed Charles with Mayor Mitchell and other city officials in private meetings, their faces animated in discussion around financial ledgers. Handwritten notes in Charles's distinctive script detailed percentages, dates, and coded references to municipal accounts. "This goes far beyond simple embezzlement," Beatrice said, her voice barely above a whisper. The entire town leadership was involved. The dawn broke with soft gray light filtering through the frost-covered windows of the cabin. Eleanor had stabilized overnight but remained weak, her complexion ashen, as Margaret applied cool compresses to her forehead. The snowstorm had intensified, transforming the landscape into an impassable white desert. "All roads to Moose Lake are blocked for at least 24 hours, Fraser reported after checking his radio. "Medical evacuation is impossible until the storm passes." Chen examined the documents methodically at the kitchen table, organizing them into categorical piles. "These transfer records show a systematic diversion of funds spanning nearly 15 years, she observed, pointing to a series of bank statements. "And these photographs provide clear evidence of conspiracy." Beatrice settled into a chair across from Chen, her aged hands trembling slightly as she pointed to specific records. "Charles kept meticulous documentation of everything. I believe it was his insurance policy. If anyone tried to betray him, he could take them all down." In the small bedroom, Michael sat beside Eleanor, who had awakened briefly. "We couldn't risk your life too," she whispered, her papery hand clutching his. "The threatening calls started coming 3 days before we left. They knew we had found Charles's records. The food situation in the cabin became concerning by midday. Mackenzie and Fraser volunteered to check the rabbit traps the sisters maintained in the surrounding woods, donning snowshoes and extra layers before venturing into the blizzard. Margaret revealed more details as she prepared a thin soup from the remaining vegetables. "We found everything accidentally. I was organizing Charles's office after the funeral when the false bottom of his desk drawer simply gave way. There they were, all his secrets, neatly documented." In a private moment in the wood storage area attached to the cabin, Michael confronted Beatrice. "Why didn't you tell me about the threats? I could have helped, protected you." Her weathered face crumpled with emotion. "They called late one night, a week before we disappeared. The voice said they knew we had found Charles's documents. They threatened to harm you, Michael. We couldn't bear the thought of putting you in danger." Chen established a secure radio communication with her team in Lakeside, speaking in carefully coded language. "We need discreet surveillance on the gardener and his assistants. potential connection to our gardening case. By evening, the storm had begun to subside, but a new tension permeated the cabin when Mackenzie returned from checking the traps, his expression grave. "There are fresh tracks in the snow around the property," he reported, removing his ice-crusted hat. "Someone's been watching the cabin in the last few hours, and it wasn't any of us." The group immediately implemented security measures, drawing curtains, minimizing lights, and positioning themselves strategically throughout the cabin. Margaret moved about the kitchen preparing a meager meal from their dwindling supplies, her voice barely audible. "They found us again, after all these years." As night descended, they took turns keeping watch. During Michael's shift at 2 in the morning, the silence was suddenly broken by the distant thrumming of helicopter rotors, growing steadily louder. Moments later, powerful searchlights cut through the darkness of the forest, and the sound of vehicles approaching on the snow-covered road reached the cabin. A voice boomed through a megaphone cutting through the night. "Special Agent Diana Chen, identify yourself. This is Deputy Director Thornton of the FBI. Your operation is no longer authorized." Flashlights sliced through the pre-dawn darkness as federal agents surrounded the cabin. Deputy Director Andrew Thornton emerged from the swirling snow, brushing ice crystals from his expensive coat as he strode through the door that Mackenzie reluctantly opened. "Agent Chen, you are officially removed from this unauthorized investigation," Thornton announced, his authoritative voice filling the small space. At 58, his silver hair and commanding presence had intimidated countless subordinates throughout his career. Chen stood her ground in the center of the room, Fraser and Mackenzie watching tensely, while Michael positioned himself protectively beside his elderly aunts. "With all due respect, sir, this investigation was properly registered and approved by the Cleveland office," she countered, her calm tone belying her internal alarm. Thornton gave the documents from the safe a cursory examination, his expression momentarily faltering when he encountered certain photographs before quickly regaining his composure. "These documents are now federal evidence. They will be confiscated immediately." Michael observed the interaction carefully, noting how Thornton deliberately avoided looking at photos showing him with Charles Whitman and Mayor Mitchell. Using the confusion of the moment, Michael discreetly photographed several key documents with his cell phone when the agent's attention was directed elsewhere. In the small bedroom, Eleanor's condition had worsened. Margaret applied cold compresses to her sister's forehead, whispering comforting words while Beatrice remained torn between attending to her sister and monitoring the increasingly hostile situation in the main room. The memory of a teenage Michael visiting Lakeside suddenly resurfaced. He recalled briefly seeing his Uncle Charles in an informal meeting with a younger Thornton, the two men laughing and sharing cigars on the back deck. The connection he'd missed for years now became clear. Chen retreated to a corner, speaking in hushed tones with Fraser. "Something's wrong. This containment operation is disproportionate for a simple case of exceeding authority." The snowstorm finally began to subside at dawn, allowing clearer communications. Michael seized a moment of privacy in the cabin's tiny bathroom to send the photographs of the documents to Linda Barkley with an urgent message. "Trust only Chen. Possible compromise at high FBI levels." Thornton efficiently organized the evacuation, assigning 2 agents to accompany the Whitman sisters and deliberately separating them from Michael and Chen. "They need to be properly processed as federal witnesses," he explained with bureaucratic precision. Eleanor's crisis intensified dramatically, forcing Thornton to allow paramedics who had arrived by helicopter to examine her. The medical assessment was grim. She needed immediate transport to a proper hospital. Beatrice, showing the fierce determination that had sustained her through 95 years, confronted Thornton directly. "We've lived nearly a century, young man. We're not easily intimidated. Either we go together or we don't go." Amidst the confusion, Margaret seized the opportunity to discreetly press a small leather-bound book into Michael's hands. "My diary," she whispered. "I started recording everything when my first suspicions arose, more than 20 years ago. There are names, dates, amounts." Chen made a calculated decision, officially surrendering the original documents to Thornton while exchanging a meaningful glance with Michael, that confirmed they shared an alternative plan. The evacuation finally commenced as the morning sun broke through the clouds. Eleanor was carefully carried on a stretcher to the medical helicopter, Beatrice insisting on accompanying her despite protests from Thornton's agents. Margaret embraced Michael for a long moment before boarding. "I trust you to do what's right, as we've always tried to do." As the medical helicopter lifted off with Eleanor and Beatrice, and Thornton organized ground transportation for the others, Michael's cell phone vibrated with a message from Linda Barkley. Documents received. Thornton appears in unrelated Senate Ethics Committee investigation. Mayor Mitchell just purchased one-way ticket to Cayman Islands. We have 24 hours maximum. Michael stared at Linda Barkley's message, his heart pounding. 24 hours to stop a conspiracy that had taken decades to build and had already destroyed countless lives in Lakeside. He glanced at Margaret sitting silently beside him in the SUV as they were transported back to Moose Lake, her diary clutched in his hands like a lifeline. "We need to get this information to people we can trust," he whispered to Chen, who nodded almost imperceptibly from the front seat. In the makeshift command center at the Pine Retreat Lodge, Michael, Chen, Fraser, and Margaret immediately began working to compile the evidence from Margaret's diary with the digital copies Michael had managed to capture. The diary proved invaluable. Decades of meticulous observations recorded in Margaret's elegant handwriting, complete with dates, coded references, and specific details about meetings she had witnessed. "Charles always used specific phrases when discussing business on the phone in our presence," Margaret explained, her aged fingers tracing entries from the early 90s. "I started noticing patterns, writing them down. Garden project meant pension fund. Fertilizer was money laundering." Chen used Fraser's secure satellite connection to contact agents she trusted implicitly in the Cleveland office, carefully avoiding official channels that might alert Thornton. "This goes beyond municipal fraud," she explained. "We have evidence suggesting Thornton has been protecting this network for years." In Lakeside, Linda Barkley was orchestrating her own counter-operation. The private investigator had built a career on discretion and cultivating valuable contacts. Within hours of receiving Michael's files, she had arranged secure meetings with trusted journalists and federal prosecutors unconnected to Thornton's influence sphere. At Thunder Bay Regional Hospital, Eleanor's condition had stabilized under proper medical care. Beatrice maintained her vigil at her sister's bedside, refusing to leave despite the FBI agent posted outside the door. When Eleanor finally opened her eyes, her first words were, "Did Michael get the diary?" Michael's cell phone vibrated with an incoming call. Thornton's voice was smooth, reasonable. "Michael, I understand your emotional investment in this situation. I'm prepared to offer full immunity for your aunts, no questions asked, no charges filed, in exchange for your discretion regarding certain peripheral names in the investigation." The implication was clear: protect the powerful, sacrifice the smaller players. Michael's grip tightened on Margaret's diary as he ended the call without committing. "He's desperate," Chen observed. "He knows we have enough to expose everyone." Margaret's diary provided the final pieces they needed, detailed accounts of meetings at the Whitman house where she had served tea while pretending not to notice the hushed conversations. Names, dates, and amounts carefully recorded, creating a comprehensive map of corruption that spanned 2 decades. Chen made the most significant call of her career that evening, directly contacting FBI Director Phillips in Washington, bypassing the entire chain of command. "Sir, I have evidence of obstruction at the deputy director level in an ongoing financial crimes investigation," she began, her voice steady despite knowing she was potentially ending her career. The Washington Post published their first piece on the scandal at exactly 9 o'clock the next morning. Ohio municipal fraud, connected to high-ranking federal officials. The article, carefully vetted by the paper's legal team, presented enough evidence to demand immediate action while protecting sources. Chen received confirmation at noon. Thornton had been temporarily suspended pending investigation, and the original documents were being recovered by trusted agents. The Whitman sisters' detailed records had created an evidence trail too solid to ignore or suppress. Michael called Beatrice at the hospital, his voice breaking as he shared the news. "It's happening, Tia Bay. The truth is finally coming out." "Eleanor is awake," Beatrice whispered back, tears evident in her voice. "She wants to know if we can finally come home." The next morning, as Michael and Margaret prepared to travel to Thunder Bay Regional Hospital to reunite with the other sisters, urgent news arrived. Mayor Mitchell had been found on his boat in Lake Erie with a self-inflicted gunshot wound and a detailed confession letter, but the name of the mysterious uncle, the most powerful figure in the conspiracy, had been carefully removed from the document. The torn confession letter left by Mayor Mitchell created a new mystery. Who was the powerful uncle figure that had been carefully erased from the document? This question, however, would have to wait as more pressing matters demanded attention. 20 years after vanishing from Lakeside, the Whitman sisters prepared for their return. A sleek private jet, arranged by the FBI as part of their witness protection program, carried the three elderly women, along with Michael and Agent Chen, across the spring sky toward Cleveland. Eleanor, still weak but determined, gazed out the window at the familiar shoreline of Lake Erie, emerging through scattered clouds. "It looks smaller somehow," she murmured, her thin hand pressed against the glass. The motorcade that met them at the airport moved efficiently through the city streets toward Lakeside. Reporters clustered at intersections, cameras flashing against the tinted windows, as Chen explained the security arrangements. "You're important federal witnesses now. We'll maintain protection until all the prosecutions are complete." Approaching Lakeside, they found the town entrance adorned with welcome banners and spring flowers. Residents lined the sidewalks with mixed expressions, most supportive, some curious, a few noticeably reserved. The three sisters sat straighter as they passed familiar landmarks that had changed in subtle ways over 2 decades. Outside the town hall stood the red Pontiac, meticulously restored by local classic car enthusiasts. Margaret gasped at the sight, tears flowing freely down her wrinkled cheeks as they passed the vehicle that had played such a crucial role in their elaborate disappearance. The Victorian house on Maple Street loomed ahead, its gingerbread trim freshly painted, the garden overgrown but showing signs of recent attention. Beatrice hesitated on the porch steps, her hand trembling on Michael's arm as she stood before the home she never expected to see again. "I'm not sure I can do this," she whispered. Inside, the house had been preserved almost like a museum to their disappearance. Family photographs still hung on walls, Eleanor's piano waited in the corner, and in the kitchen, the sisters found their china teacups, now carefully displayed in a glass cabinet alongside newspaper clippings about their case. The following afternoon, an official press conference was held at the Lakeside Town Hall. The three Whitman sisters sat side by side as the newly appointed mayor delivered a formal apology for the persecution they had suffered and the corruption they had exposed. When invited to speak, Eleanor rose shakily to the microphone, her voice thin but clear. "We never wanted to be heroines. We only wanted to protect those we loved from the truth we discovered." That evening, Beatrice reunited with former colleagues from the local hospital, now elderly themselves. They shared stories over tea in the Victorian house's parlor, and one retired nurse revealed she had kept Beatrice's cinnamon cookie recipe alive, baking them for hospital fundraisers every Christmas. In the back garden, Michael and Gregory Whitman finally confronted each other after years of suspicion and resentment. "I always believed they knew where the money was," Gregory admitted, unable to meet Michael's eyes. "I never imagined they were hiding to protect all of us." The following morning, Margaret walked slowly through the neglected garden, pointing out to Michael where each plant should be. "The roots are still there," she observed, kneeling with difficulty to touch the soil. "They just need care to bloom again." A small but significant ceremony was held at the Methodist Church on Sunday, where the sisters were welcomed back to the choir Eleanor had served for 50 years. Tears flowed freely when she attempted, but could no longer reach, the high notes of Amazing Grace. In the Victorian house's living room 1 week after their return, The three sisters made their announcement to Michael and a small gathering of town officials. The property would be donated to become the Whitman Community Center, dedicated to educational programs on financial ethics and citizenship. Later that evening, Beatrice presented Michael with a wooden box containing 20 years of unsent letters, each dated for birthdays, Christmases, and other important milestones they had missed together. As twilight fell over Lake Erie, the three sisters sat side by side in wheelchairs on the pier, watching the sunset over the same waters that had guarded their secret for so many years. Michael stood behind them, his hands resting gently on Beatrice's shoulders. When a persistent journalist later asked if she regretted disappearing for so many years, Eleanor smiled serenely, exchanging meaningful looks with her sisters before answering, "Truth never comes without sacrifice, and the greatest secrets are those we carry for love. We don't regret protecting our brother, our family, our town, but we rejoice that we can finally live our last days in the light, not in shadows."